So as you heard, we're kicking off a new sermon series that will last us for the next 6 weeks titled Elijah. Elijah is widely considered to be the greatest of all the Old Testament prophets. And his story is told primarily in the Old Testament in 1st and 2nd Kings. And it doesn't take you very long as you read his story to realize that Elijah was an amazing person who lived a truly remarkable life. In 1 Kings 17, you saw he appears on the scene, and through nothing but his prayers, he causes a 3-year drought. Later in the same chapter, we'll see he miraculously causes a jar of flour and a jug of oil to produce an endless supply simply by his word. A little later in the chapter, he actually raises a child from the dead. Then in 1 Kings 18, he encounters the prophets of Baal, and he calls down fire from heaven. He goes on to confront evil kings and queens and boldly speaks for God. And as if all of this isn't enough, then he ends his earthly life by ascending into heaven in a whirlwind. And even then, after his earthly life is over, Elijah's influence continues. The prophet Malachi speaks of Elijah as the one who will come and prepare the way for Jesus Christ. And later in the Gospels, Jesus says that this prophecy was fulfilled in the coming of John the Baptist. Elijah appears again in the Gospels with Moses at the transfiguration of Jesus near the end of his earthly ministry. And even as Jesus is hanging on the cross, the crowds are thinking about Elijah, it says. As Jesus cries out, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, the gospel writers tell us that some who were watching were confused and thought that Jesus was in fact crying out for Elijah. So Elijah is an incredibly important figure throughout the whole Bible, both in the Old and the New Testaments. He was very, very special. And that's why it's more than a little odd that the one time that the New Testament writer James talks about him, he says this: Elijah was a man just like us. Really? I mean, if he had said Peter was a man just like us, that would make a lot of sense. Peter was well-meaning, but often impulsive and foolish. And that sounds like the kind of man who was just like us. Or if James had said David was a man just like us, we would probably agree with that. David loved God and served God, but David also made some terrible and tragic mistakes in his life. David was a man just like us. Or say if James had said Thomas was a man just like us, we could accept that too. Thomas was a disciple, but he struggled with doubts at times, and of course, so do we. Thomas was a man just like us. But when you read the story of Elijah, hardly anything ever happens that makes you think he was just like us. So how can James say this? What are we missing here? Well, we are missing something, because here's the full text from James. He says, Elijah was a man just like us. He prayed earnestly that it would not rain, and it did not rain on the land for 3.5 years. Again he prayed, and the heavens gave rain, and the earth produced its crops. Elijah was a man just like us in that he prayed. He was not like us when he called down fire from heaven or raised the dead or ascended into heaven in a whirlwind. But he was just like us when he prayed. Now, I think you'll agree with me, it doesn't really seem like it, right? It seems like amazing stuff happened when he prayed that does not happen when you and I pray. And that may be true, but the point that James is making is that amazing things can happen when you pray also. If you can learn to pray like Elijah prayed. So that begs the question, what is it that stands out about Elijah's prayers? And I want to talk with you about three things today. Three things that stood out about Elijah's prayers. First, that Elijah prayed in faith. A second, that Elijah prayed with perseverance. And finally, third, that Elijah prayed with results. So let's talk about these. Let's look at them together. First, what stood out about Elijah's prayers is that Elijah prayed in faith. And when I say that he prayed in faith, that means much more than just that he believed there was a God up there somewhere listening to what he had to say. Praying in faith means that you are praying absolutely convinced that God will, in fact, answer this prayer. For example, 1 Kings 18:41 said, Elijah said to Ahab, "Go, eat and drink, for there is the sound of a heavy rain." And only then, after he had told Ahab it was going to rain, did he begin to pray that the rain would come. And that's amazing. And that's exactly what Jesus calls each of us to do. Jesus, you'll remember, said in Mark 11, "Whatever you ask for in prayer, believe that you have received it, and you will." And if you ask, well, how can you possibly do that? Well, you have to understand that praying in faith requires something else, that you are actively trying to discern what God's will is. I have to tell you, I've been thinking about sharing this for a while now, but I've been a little hesitant because I don't want to discourage anyone in their prayer life. But I think we have to say this, that one of the major problems that many of us face when it comes to prayer is that we often pray things that are frankly pretty trivial. Things that it doesn't really matter that much whether God answers them or not. Prayers like, God, please make the weather good today. God, please help me get over this cold. And we can certainly bring any concern we have to God, and we should, but along with that, I think we have to be careful about praying too much for things that really don't matter that much, and too little for things that matter very much. One of my favorite authors is a man named Richard Foster, and he has written some wonderful things about prayer, and here's one of his astute observations. He says in one of his books, "I took the Gospels and cut out every reference to prayer and pasted them onto sheets of paper. When I could read Jesus' teaching on prayer at one sitting, I was shocked. Perhaps the most astonishing characteristic of Jesus praying is that when he prayed for others, he never concluded by saying, 'If it be thy will.' Nor did the apostles or prophets when they were praying for others. They obviously believed that they knew what the will of God was before they prayed the prayer of faith. They were so immersed in the milieu of the Holy Spirit that when they encountered a specific situation, they knew what should be done." Now, Foster goes on and he rightly says, there is certainly a proper time and place to pray, "If it be thy will, Lord," particularly when it's unclear what God's will is. Right? Jesus himself prayed that prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane. But see, that's precisely the point. The point is that prayer is to be a tool that helps us discern God's will, not one that helps us remain ignorant of it. We can ask God for anything we want to, certainly, but as we do so, God wants us to grow so that we begin to want and ask for what he wants. We often forget that part. So that's the first lesson. Elijah prayed in faith. Now, the second lesson we can learn about prayer from Elijah is to see that Elijah prayed with perseverance. 1 Kings 18:43 tells us that that 7 times Elijah prayed for rain, and 7 times he sent his servant off to go and check the horizon, but over and over he kept coming with the same answer back. There's nothing there. And then comes this great simple line. 7 times Elijah said, "Go back." I love that line. Because Elijah wouldn't quit. He wouldn't give up. And why? Because he was praying in faith. He knew this was God's will. He was only praying for what God himself had promised he would do. You see, if you're just throwing up trivial requests at God or requests that you're not really sure if he likes or not, no wonder you don't persevere in prayer. But when you begin to allow prayer to shape you, to know the will of God better, then prayer becomes a whole new ballgame. And friends, this is an absolutely critical lesson to learn because life has a tendency to get more and more challenging as it goes along. Did you notice that that's what happened to Elijah? Our story starts with the stoppage of the rain, but during the drought, at first, God miraculously provides for Elijah. It says in verse 6, amazing words. Verse 6 says, "The ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook." Now, if this had been me, I would have said to God, "Hey, God, what about lunch?" Right? But Elijah was okay with this. He was doing well. This is amazing. But then in verse 7, it says this, "Sometime later, the brook dried up." Anyone else here read that and think, come on, God, give the guy a break? I mean, Elijah's been so good. He's been praying. He's been obeying. He's been trusting you every step along the way. Can't you let the guy keep the doggone brook? And God certainly could have. He could have kept the brook from drying up. So why didn't he? And I think the answer is that this is just one of the ways that God often works. Haven't you noticed that God often brings new challenges to your life to test you and see if your faith really is in the blesser and not just the blessings? These are precisely the kind of circumstances that are required to teach us how to persevere in prayer. Here's another one of my favorite quotes about prayer along these lines. This is a different author. He says this, "I remember praying through our finances, and though we had enough to supply our needs for the present, I was concerned about the long term. I trusted him enough for today, but kept praying that he would do something to take my anxiety away for tomorrow. But God didn't want me to trust in my IRA or the state lottery for security. He wanted me to trust in him. What most enhances my relationship with Jesus is my ability to trust him no matter what circumstance I'm in." And this is the part I really love. "He rarely answers prayers that ask him to fix my circumstances so that I can trust him less. His desire has always been that I would trust him more." And maybe God is challenging some of you right now to trust him more, not less. That's the second lesson we learn from Elijah, because Elijah prayed with perseverance. But now there's one last lesson, and that's that Elijah prayed with results. If there's one thing that stands out about Elijah's prayers, it's that when Elijah prayed, stuff happened. But I'm going to guess that some of you aren't going to like that point very much. Because this maybe sounds a little, name it, claim it to you. And that's obviously a good danger to beware of. Right? Because when Jesus says, ask and you shall receive, he's not saying, give me your list. Right? What do you want? Big house, SUV, Caribbean vacation home, name it, claim it. It's all yours. That's not the way it works. But you have to see that there's a danger on the other side of the road here. And that's the danger of faithless prayer, where you pray almost expecting there to be no results. Or when you fail to learn from the times God makes you wait for answers to your prayer. Let me share with you one last word along these lines from Richard Foster. Great quote here. He says, to understand that the work of prayer involves a learning process, saves us from arrogantly dismissing it as false or unreal. I love this illustration. If we turn on our television set and it does not work, we do not declare that there are no such things as electronic frequencies in the air or on the cable. We assume something is wrong, something we can find and correct. We check the plug, switch, circuitry until we discover what is blocking the flow of this mysterious energy that transmits pictures. We know the problem has been found and fixed by seeing whether or not the TV works. It is the same with prayer. We can determine if we are praying correctly if the requests come to pass. If not, we look for the block. Perhaps we are praying wrongly. Perhaps something within us needs changing. Perhaps there are new principles of prayer to be learned. Perhaps patience and persistence are needed. We listen, make the necessary adjustments, and try again. We know that our prayers are being answered as surely as we can know that the television set is working. So there you have it, 3 lessons on prayer from Elijah. Elijah prayed in faith, Elijah prayed with perseverance, and Elijah prayed with results. But please understand, the point of all this is not that Elijah was so amazing, and if you just go home and try really hard, you can be like him too. The point is not about Elijah at all. Because as James says, there really was nothing special about the man Elijah. Elijah was a man just like us. The point is that the God who worked amazing things in and through Elijah can do the same in and through you. The God Elijah trusted is the same God you are trusting. The God who brought down fire from heaven for Elijah also brought down Jesus from heaven to the manger of Bethlehem for you. And the God who raised Elijah into heaven in a whirlwind also raised Jesus Christ from the dead for you. So may we all find hope and encouragement in these simple but amazing words. Elijah was a man just like us. Let's bow our heads and pray.